This is a Newsbud presentation made possible only by you, our supporters. Please visit our Kickstarter campaign and pledge today. Hi everyone, I'm Spiro with Newsbud.com. Welcome to this week's Roundtable, where we will be discussing the recent tensions between the U.S. and Russia. More specifically, we will look at Turkey and where they fit into all of this. We all remember the recent failed coup attempt in Turkey, which the Turkish government has blamed on the United States and Fethullah Gülen, and appeared to push Turkey closer to Russia and away from the U.S. and NATO. Shortly after that, Vice President Joe Biden paid a visit to Turkey, which coincided with a joint U.S.-Turkey military offensive in Syria. Turkey has also struck a new energy deal with Russia, so it looks like Turkey is kind of going back and forth between the U.S. and Russia. Now, recently, Turkey's deputy prime minister stated, "The fighting in Syria has put the world on the brink of a global war," and quote, "If this proxy war continues, after this, let me be clear, America and Russia will come to a point of war." Now I'd like to welcome our panel to hear what they have to say about all of this. Joining me is Newsbud's own Professor Filip Kovacevic of the Russian newspaper Monitor, and Newsbud's founder-in-chief, Sibel Edmonds. Now, Sibel, it has been a while since we've covered Turkey, and there have been many recent developments. Now, what's the latest on your radar?
Well, interestingly, we had this roundtable discussion talking about Turkey's position switching back and forth like a pendulum, like a yo-yo. As you just mentioned, Spiro, it started with right immediately after the coup. President Erdogan went to Russia, met with President Putin, and he even brought up, or they brought up, or both parties brought up the case of NATO and the NATO base. There was this rumors or discussions or behind the scenes talks about Turkey actually shutting down the NATO base there in Incirlik, and possibly Russians using it for some of their operations in Syria. And then, of course, that visit took place with VP Biden, and suddenly Turkey's tune changed and started swinging to the other side. And during that meeting, as you remember, they also had Barzani coming to Turkey. And he's a very important figure because both with Syria and Iraq, the Kurdish card becomes a very, very, very important card in terms of what can take place. That applies to everyone. And the Kurdish cards has always been one of the most important cards out there. He came to Turkey and he was present during the meeting between VP Biden and the Turkish officials. And as you just mentioned again, they had the intense operations beginning, and they went into Syria, etc., etc. So it looked like Turkey was swinging back towards the United States. And all that talk about Incirlik base kind of died down. That whole noise that we were hearing in the background, that's possible, or is it possible? But then in the last few days, several important developments have been taking place. One is what's going on with Iraq, and especially with Mosul. And again, Turkey has become a very, very important, and the most important outside Iraq nation on what is going to happen in Iraq. Because again, with this particular region, with this particular topic, you're again looking at the Kurdish factions there and the Kurdish question, and coming down again to the same thing, the Kurdish card. So during this 3-4 days with the Iraq and Mosul topics and the subjects brewing, we also had the news coming out saying, well, Turkey's President Erdogan is swinging back possibly towards Russia again. The energy deal between Russia and Turkey was signed. So that is concrete. So that's one thing that is concrete. We can say now it's done, because that is done. But also we have started hearing some other buzz in the background about, and there was this DEPCA file, and we are going to make the link available to our viewers, saying that there is a possibility that Turkey has been with Russia engaging in certain strategic moves to block the US's operation in Syria, which is, they view it as nefarious. It is. And in fact, there may be some double crossing there, that even though during these operations into Syria, Turkey was backed and actually engaged in it together with the US, with some of the late operations there and what Turkey has been doing in Syria, it looks as if Turkey is engaged in operations that would benefit Russia, Syria, and Iran, and that faction, not the United States, the West, NATO. So that is brewing, and we're going to have that link available. So we are back where we were before, exactly in the same spot, saying, is the swinging back and forth due to or caused by President Erdogan not knowing exactly which way he's going to really swing towards? Is it that? Or are we talking about possible double crossing here, that during the visit with Russia, possibly Turkey and Russia had some other kinds of behind the scenes agreements on how Turkey, even though they would move into the Syria and go into those operations with the United States, they may actually do or engage in things that would benefit the Russian-Syrian side. So that question comes into the picture and it still remains. And of course, the Kurdish issue with Iraq, that can change the entire picture. Because if you look at the latest news coming out of Iraq, you are seeing certain factions in Iraq telling Turkey, hey, you can't use this to come into Iraq and enter Iraq and say, okay, now I'm going to be a major player, especially in the northern portion with the Kurds. And basically they are saying, you step back. We are dealing with the United States on this whole Iraq operations, and we don't want you to be an actor in here. On the other hand, with Barzani has been actually playing the side that is the NATO side, Turkey side, and he has been always this puppet figure out there that has been basically keeping the Kurdish faction muffled, quiet when it comes to certain aggressions committed by Turkey within the borders in northern Iraq. With all that, I think it is really time, it's way past time to bring an outside perspective, more macro perspective into what is really happening here. What are we seeing with Turkey, with this pendulum, with this yo-yo-like swinging from the Russian side to the United States? Because while all these conversations are happening, I just read the news that Germany was fortifying their members in Turkey, in Incirlik base. So they had sent several of their officers, more officers into Incirlik base in Turkey. So what is really going on, and how that is affecting, or how that is influenced, of course, by Russia as well, and hear from Professor Kovacevic and try to get a better, more macro perspective, outside good perspective on what is happening really with Turkey, Russia, and the Atlantis, the United States.
What's happening in Europe at this time is essentially the struggle between two geopolitical worldviews, between two ideologies, Atlanticism and Eurasianism. Atlanticism is represented by NATO, it's represented by the IMF, by the World Bank, by George Soros, by Atlantic Council, by the Council on Foreign Relations, and so on. And Eurasianism, essentially, at this point of time, is represented by the Russian foreign policy, and perhaps also the Chinese foreign policy. And the big question right now is where Turkey is going to locate itself. In other words, where the current presidential administration of Erdogan is going to place itself in this struggle between two grand ideologies. If we look at the Turkish history, we find a lot of ground for expecting that in the end, Russia and Turkey could be on the same side. Let's go back to what happened after the end of the World War I, when Turkey was essentially occupied by the European powers, and when Mustafa Kemal Atatürk led an effort to war against the European powers that lasted 3 years and was successful in forming the modern Turkish nation state. At that time, he was helped by the Bolsheviks, by Lenin, by the Soviet Union. In other words, in those days after the end of World War II, both countries were isolated from Europe, the Soviet Union and Turkey, and they found a common point of cooperation, and they formed a strategic partnership at the time, which helped to lead to some very friendly negotiations about the borders. And the Soviet Union actually returned some territories to Turkey at the time. So we have a precedent. We have a precedent of close cooperation between Russia and Turkey when both countries, just like today, found themselves at the attack of the Atlanticists, of the Western Alliance. If we look at this Euro-Asian perspective in Turkey, it's stronger and it's getting stronger. And because it connects to the Kemalist ideology, which is the ideology of populism, nationalism, and secularism in Turkey. But more than that, it has this anti-imperialist orientation. This is the key, because Eurasianism as well has this anti-imperialist orientation that says, you know what, we are not going to let the Western powers tell us what to do. We are going to defend our national sovereignty, not as a value in itself, but as a means to defend the right of our people, of the citizens of these countries, to have important say in political decision-making, in deciding which direction their country is going to take. And this is what's happening in Russia at this time and also in Turkey. So what we are seeing in Turkey, I think, is the resurgence of the idea that Turkey can form an alliance with the East and be successful in this alliance.
That seems to be, like you said, the question there. I mean, where you look through history and you see that Russia and Turkey have also worked together, but you can also see throughout history that they've been put at odds against each other as well. So
this is true, Spiro, and historians have counted about 10 wars that Russia and Turkey had. However, if you look at more closely at these wars, you'll see that every single time there was an interest of some Western powers in provoking them to come to blows. Every single time. Sometimes these Western powers would support Turkey against Russia, and sometimes they would support Russia against Turkey. So what we essentially had in those wars is these two countries allowing to become playthings of the Western powers. What they need to do at this time is refuse to play this role and develop common cooperation, or at least some kind of point of agreement where they can come together, because they have essentially the same opponent. And this opponent is neoliberal globalism. And neoliberal globalism, also called Atlanticism, wants to develop an ideology imposed on everybody. And in fact, I would say that Turkey would get much more respect for its culture and traditions from the Eurasianists than from the Atlanticists.
So here is my question to you, though, Professor Kovacevic, and that is, how can that be possible with Turkey remaining to be a NATO member? Because that alone seems to be, is just impossibility. Because we are also looking at this extremely important region, all the stands, including Azerbaijan, and then you're looking Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan and all the stands, Turkic heritage, shared the same Turkic language, Muslim, right? And we know that the United States, and based on the whole grand chess game and the Brzezinski plan, even though today we keep hearing about Syria and Iraq and Libya and Saudi Arabia, everything, I would say, in less than a decade is going to be shifted towards all the stands, the ones that we don't hear much about, because you're looking at all the natural resources there, from oil to gas to minerals, and of course the issue of pipelines. And we know that NATO has been very active targeting those former Soviet blocs, former Soviet states. Kyrgyzstan, sure, they shut down Manas air base and they kicked out the United States. So that was one loss in the United States book. But we know Azerbaijan is a NATO member candidate that has been a candidate since, I don't know, 2004, both with their expenditure and training. And we already have troops, even though people don't know about it, in Azerbaijan. And these are NATO US people, military troop in Azerbaijan. And Turkey has been a facilitator in a way between these former Soviet states and the NATO, because they are taking Turkey's lead, or that had been the plan from the beginning. Turkey has been a great facilitator as a NATO member, Muslim, Turkic heritage, to go and start devouring those former Soviet states, bringing them into the NATO fold. You know, it's not only Ukraine, but it's Azerbaijan, it was Kyrgyzstan. So looking at that, and as long as Turkey is a NATO member, how could there be a chance for that kind of an alliance, no matter how much that would make sense, let's say, on the paper, or even to be to the advantage of Turks? Is it even possible without Turkey moving out of the Atlanticist evil circle, NATO?
Those are very good questions, Sibel. I would say, first of all, that if the coup against Erdogan had succeeded, by this time we would have had a war between Russia and Turkey. This was the plan. And in fact, if you look at who specifically shot down the Russian military jet over Syria in November 2015, it was the officers that belonged to the coup plotters. In other words, the Turkish Air Force directly worked for the Atlanticists in NATO to provoke the conflict between Russia and Turkey. And if you look at the New York Times and the articles in the New York Times in those days after the Russian jet was shot down, you'll see a lot of joy in those articles that Erdogan and Putin will go against each other. This was seen in the articles themselves and also in the editorials. So it is clear that this Atlanticist faction represented by the Washington establishment and the CFR wanted, that was the plan, for Turkey to go to war against Russia, for Russia to attack Turkey. This was the plan. This plan failed, and we are all should be happy because the world was at the brink of a global conflagration, and we were saved. At the last minute, we were saved. So already in June, Erdogan apologized to Putin. This was at the end of June, and then the coup was put into practice about 2 weeks later, and it failed. And so what Erdogan is doing right now, he's essentially purging all those plotters, many of whom are in NATO, many of whom were in the United States at the time of the coup. In fact, there is the example of a Turkish rear admiral. His name is Mustafa Zeki Gurlu, who was here in the United States on June 15th, and then he immediately requested an asylum to stay in the United States. So it is clear that Erdogan at the last minute figured out what was going on, and that he stopped this very dangerous geopolitical project of causing a war between Russia and Turkey. Now to go back to the Turkic republics of Central Asia that you mentioned. From what I know is that the people in those states, they are firmly supportive of a Eurasian perspective. They cannot be convinced to buy into Atlanticist neoliberal economics. In other words, they want some kind of a socialist state to take care of them, and they want to have more equality in their society. This is a part of their tradition. It's equality, not the huge gap between the rich and the poor that neoliberalism is bringing us. So what's going to happen in those countries, and in some, we have seen the transformation. For instance, in Kyrgyzstan, we have seen Kyrgyzstan moving from a pro-NATO state by hosting the US military base in Manas to becoming a pro-Eurasianist, pro-Russian state by essentially disconnecting the base and closing the base down. And the current government in Kyrgyzstan is against opening the base again. And in fact, now they also have a Russian base. So it seems to me that this whole project to integrate Central Asia into some kind of Atlanticist framework on the side of NATO and the US establishment has failed. Brzezinski has failed. However, this is not to say that we are not going to see the corrupt political elites in these countries, such as in Azerbaijan, trying to remain in power by being helped from the outside. In other words, going against their own people. And I think Erdogan realized at the last moment that he should not go against the people. And what people in Turkey want, in my opinion, is they want their national sovereignty back. They are tired of being dominated by the forces from the outside, by NATO, by the Western Europeans, and by the United States. They want to take their country back. And they can take it back in a different geopolitical framework with the Eurasianists rather than with the Atlanticists, because they have much more in common with Eurasia than with the powers of the sea, the Great Britain and the United States. At the same time, what's also important is to look at the religious situation, because in the past, the Western European powers have used religion, Christianity against Islam, to cause problems in the Balkans and in the Central Asia, and also at the margins between Russia and Turkey. And I think that if Turkey and Russia are on the same side as they should be, they can overcome this religious card. They can prevail over the attempts to cause a conflict between Christians and Muslims. After all, let me remind you that Russia has a significant Muslim population, about 15%, which is about 20 million people. And these Muslims in Russia have been integrated into the Russian society. And in fact, there was a big mosque being opened in Moscow when Erdogan was invited. And this was in September of 2015. So I think the Russian administration at this time is very careful to have very good relations with the Muslims in Russia. Of course, the other side, the opponents of Russia, are trying to provoke the Muslims of the Caucasus to take stand against the Russian government. And we've seen the Chechnya conflict, we've seen what's going on in Dagestan today, and also in some other parts of the Caucasus. So in my opinion, what's important at this time is to cherish this Eurasian tradition, which exists both in Russia and in Turkey, and which says to the Europeans and the Atlanticists, we want you out because we want to be in charge of our destiny. We do not want to allow our countries to become your colonies. And that is the plan that you have for us, and this plan will be unsuccessful.
Now, everything you said is 100% rational and logical. So have we had rational and logical players on this chessboard? This is exactly what we would be seeing. Now, but again, going back to the recent history, Operation Gladio, and then Operation Gladio B with the target Central Asia, Caucasus. We know Turkey, as a NATO member, has been one of the most important conduits, players in Operation Gladio practices. And that includes recruiting, training, and then putting them into terrorism practices, operations into Russia by using the Chechens. And Turkey has a very long history and record. They have been doing it since mid-1990s. And then the same thing is true with what happened when we had the conflict between Georgia and Russia, and Turkey's position on that, again, as a NATO member and an Operation Gladio major player. And then, of course, so as long as, considering that recent history, and as long as currently Turkey, after the coup, I believed if everyone in this play, the players, at least for the Turkish side, were logical, we would have already began seeing the shift. by the base being closed down and Turkey saying they are withdrawing their request of membership into EU and of course NATO. But this back and forth with President Erdogan and President Obama between US and Russia while still holding that member NATO position. How could these logical things that you presented, because I believe majority of the people in Turkey, especially after the coup, would be for what you just said. Because if you read opinion pieces, if you listen to the people through the social media, that's what most people want in Turkey. And that's what you listed exactly. And that's rational. But on the other hand, we are still seeing that resistance that no, for President Erdogan, the administration, we are going to hold on to NATO. And that whole talk got suffocated and got basically, they put an end to it. And then bring into this whole scenario what's currently cooking up in Syria and what is going to escalate in Iraq with all the Mosul operations. Those elements together with Turkey's NATO membership, what kind of a drastic possibility could we be looking at? That all of a sudden Turkey is going to announce that this is it with NATO?
You know, this is a process that's going to take a long time because Turkey has been a member of NATO since 1952. So something that lasted for more than 60 years cannot be abolished and demolished in a couple of months. But the process, let's hope that the process has started because the alternative is a war. The alternative is a global conflagration, perhaps even a nuclear apocalypse. And let me tell you also that in the Balkans, most people would be happy to see this alliance between Russia and Turkey take place because it would solve a lot of unresolved issues in the Balkans. However, I agree with you, Sibel. This is very difficult. And in fact, it's going to be up to the political ability of the Turkish President Erdogan. We have to see if he has it in himself to rise up to the level of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. This is a basic test for him because Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was able to be successful against the European powers and put foundations for the modern Turkish nation state. And I know he's well respected in Turkey to this day. And now we have to see whether Erdogan can do the same for the 21st century. Can he, even though we know who Erdogan is and his policies in the 90s and the 2000s. We know how he started, but Putin started the same way. And in fact, if you look at the transcripts of different conversations, you'll see that Bill Clinton said that Putin is the person that the US can work with. George W. Bush said that Putin is very smart and he's a real patriot, and so on and so forth. But Putin has changed because he realized that if he continues down the Atlanticist path, Russia will become a colony of the Atlanticists. Not of the United States, of the Atlanticists, of a small group that rules over the US foreign policy against the interests of the most of the American people. Here we are talking about the corrupt elite that wants to dominate the world, and Russia was on their plate. And the Russia's fate was to be broken up into 5 or 6 or 10 different countries. And Putin has stopped that. He has stopped that. And now we have to see whether this wave of rebellion, of the Eurasianist rebellion, can spread into other countries. And Turkey is the closest in terms of its political culture, in terms of its traditions, and its imperial past. It's very close to Russia. And perhaps it can take the cue from the Russians in saying, well, we now have to turn the leaf and do something differently. I know it's going to be very difficult, and it's going to create a lot of problems in Turkey. The instability has started with the Kurds and the so-called terrorists, and this will be continued. But this is a struggle for the soul of a country, because Turkey, I think, in my opinion, has to a great extent been colonized by NATO. And now the question is going to be whether the Turkish military can develop more of an independence. And I have to add here that according to some news reports, Turkey and Russia have begun cooperating on military matters. There is some talk of Russia selling missiles to Turkey and developing some kind of a common missile defense system. Well, the question is who this missile defense system is going to be directed against, where the missiles are going to come from. Are they going to come from the West? That's a big question. Also, we know that the nuclear weapons from the Turkish Incirlik base have been moved out of Turkey and moved to Romania. So we are seeing again that perhaps NATO is also rethinking its relationship with Turkey. But again, the process is just beginning and it's going to take a long time. However, the alternative is a global war.
Now that you mentioned the nuclear weapons in Incirlik base, and my own state secrets privilege, which involved certain operations, Turkey and US and NATO, as part of Operation Gladio B, they were engaged in between 1997 and 2002. I would like to go on record as saying that in addition or outside those nuclear weapons in Incirlik base, Turkey has had its own nuclear weapons since 2000. And we facilitated it, the United States, the same way it was facilitated behind the scenes with Pakistan and with Israel. And as with Israel, that it was denied for decades, the fact that they did possess and they had acquired nuclear weapons, Turkey started that process in 1996, 1997, and Turkey has its own nuclear weapons technology. And if you look at a lot of the last 15, 20 years, arrests, so-called arrests by CIA chasing this nuclear proliferation actors from Malaysia, from Switzerland, the Tinner family. If you look at the top players that were all released and never brought into prosecutions, you will see the Turkish engineers and the Turkish players in the nuclear black market. So yes, they may have removed those nuclear weapons technology from the NATO base there, but one thing that the state secrets privilege in my case covered had to do with the fact that with the United States knowledge, starting in mid-1990s through nuclear black market, Turkey began acquiring its own nuclear weapons technology and has put in place its own. Now, hopefully we will never come to a point of seeing that being put in use, as we are hoping with Pakistan, with Israel, even with the drone nukes that right now is floating. But it's one thing that I would challenge anyone to contradict, because they know it. The United States has known it. FBI has known it. The State Department has known it. Turkey has had its own nuclear weapons and technologies since 2000.
Sibel, this is a very good news. And in fact, in my opinion, had Yugoslavia had a nuclear weapon, it never would have fallen apart. In other words, having a nuclear weapon is a great protection for a country to stay within its borders and to say to its opponents, no, you cannot touch us.
Well, that's a great point, both made by both of you there. Basically, what I see taking place here is, Turkey is caught in between, like obviously as we see between the West and the East, between Russia, China, US, NATO, and it's making moves to appease both, but they appear to be, for the most part, in Turkey's best interest. How much of that's being influenced, we don't know. But like you stated, Professor, Russia is talking about providing Turkey with its own missile systems. At the same time, Turkey is chomping at the bit to go into Mosul with the U.S. and so there's lots of things going on both sides. At the end of the day, who Who is Turkey going to side with? That's the big question. Their moves that they're making support both sides at this point. But in a perfect world, Turkey could just be friends with both sides, and there would be no conflict or anything like that. But I think we're all well aware of the war profiteers. They're pushing for regime change in Syria, just like they've done in other countries. And at the end of the day, will conflict be inevitable? Is yet to be seen, but the people tend to usually suffer at the end of the day here. But this brings me to a question I have for Sibel, and what she makes about the Turkish government working with the FBI in regards to Gulen. Some of that stuff, as you mentioned earlier, has kind of been put on hold. But I mean, what do you make of their working relationship with each other? Is that all for show? Are we going to see anything out of this?
I'm glad you brought up that, because it was played up in Turkish media, the fact that now the FBI and Turkish government, they are together as partners working on chasing Fethullah Gulen's financial networks and irregularities, because as a possible terror financiers, which is laughable. It's a total pretense. First of all, the FBI, even when I started working, which was a few days after September 11, they had already been investigating and monitoring Fethullah Gulen and Fethullah Gulen related networks in several divisions within the FBI, the white-collar crime area for the money laundering, but also terrorism. Fethullah Gulen and his network had been under FBI investigation with very thick files since early 2000. So they didn't have to open anything new. FBI has had enough evidence, documents, everything in their hands to arrest, bring charges against, and imprison Fethullah Gulen or extradite him since 2001. Why haven't they done it? It's not the FBI's decision in this case. It's been always the State Department. It's been always the State Department and the CIA saying, fine, monitor it, but we will not let you bring any court. We're not going to let you put it in action. So the file and the operations, the investigation would be shut down for a while. Then it would be sent to another division, let's say to counterintelligence division. But then the illegal activities of Fethullah Gulen and his network would get to a certain level when a new FBI director would start again the whole operation of chasing Fethullah Gulen network. They would start the operation, restart it, gather everything, and again, via White House, State Department, it would get shut down. So that whole thing is a farce. It's something, maybe PR thing, saying U.S. is working with Turkey on Fethullah Gulen. You also see several, especially the one that just came out via New Yorker on Fethullah Gulen. This was the first time a U.S. publication actually wrote an article casting Fethullah Gulen in a negative light, including his picture. You know, he has been from New York Times, all the pendejos we know, New York Times, CNN, they have Time magazine. He's been always photographed as this person with light coming out of his face. He is the moderate Islam's answer, the answer to find peace in the world. You know, he's this great Turkish scholar. This guy went only to the first 3 years of elementary school. Fethullah Gulen has only first, second, third degree, third year degree, not even a degree. He didn't even finish elementary school. He suddenly became a scholar. You know, he was chosen as a Time magazine Man of the Year. For the first time, New Yorker, and New Yorker is completely influenced by Israel, completely his government mouthpiece, while it's pretending to be another kind of an alternative publication. This casts Gulen in a really negative light. It shows Gulen as a cult, as this shadowy figure that is a cult with these cultish figures, with that picture where he looks evil. And if you read in between the lines, it's talking about his health is suffering. He doesn't have much to live. So it's right now a safe time for the FBI, State Department, U.S. State Department, U.S. media to start feeding their major player, their major facilitator with Operation Gladio B for CIA operations, Mullah Fethullah Gulen, as some shadowy, cultish, awful figure because the game is over. Gulen Network, as far as Gulen as a figure, as a CIA facilitator in Central Asia, Caucasus, even inside Russia, they shut down his mosques and his schools, okay? His era is over. He's already, because of this coup, the attempted coup, it was exposed. I was screaming about it 10 years ago. Nobody would listen. They would say, she keeps talking about this guy, Fethullah. What? It's a weird name. We've never heard of it. She's just a conspiracy theorist. Lo and behold, after the coup, suddenly all the U.S. newspapers started talking about Fethullah Gulen. Well, I've been on the record on Fethullah Gulen for 10 years. But this is just the dogs and pony shows because that network, its use has been over. Fethullah Gulen is going to die while awaiting extradition. And that I can guarantee right here. And I would, if I were a betting woman, I would place my bet on it. He's going to die while the U.S. and Turkey, everybody's pretending that they're going to go after him and his network. So I wouldn't put much weight on that. It's maybe a PR piece that would help the current Turkish administration because they have been in action very quiet. They were supposed to bring this lawsuit and pursue Gulen via other venues. They stopped doing that after Biden's visit. Everything was placed in back burner. So this is a kind of a safe face move, possibly, to say that, oh yeah, U.S. is cooperating with us. See, now they agree with us that Gulen is a terrorist. He needs to be pursued and extradited. They're going to continue this, and he's going to die before he gets extradited. But I have one question that I want to bring, because I had a great professor when I was taking my American literature classes. And he used to talk about Dickerson. Anyhow, he used to talk about the fact that in poetry, certain poetry, you need to turn everything around, sometimes turn it upside down and look at it in order to really see the whole picture, or a picture that may look obvious. But then once you turn your object, whatever you're looking at, the whole thing, the way it looks, the way it feels changes. Well, all the stuff we talked about, Russia and the US and the tension that has been amplified and played by the US media, by the Turkish media, by every single country's media, right? World War III may be inevitable, etc. Professor Kovacevic, is it really real? Is it possible? Is it possible that they have found this win-win situation? Because seeing that unipolar world started feeling, or to many people, so lopsided, you know, and so many people started longing for this bipolar scenario that they lived through for 50 years. You have the United States, you have the Soviet Union, and it kind of maintains the balance around the globe. Because when we are looking at what Spiro just mentioned before his question to me on Fethullah Gulen, the ultimate profiteers here, let's say the military-industrial complex. Well, that applies to both sides because all the Syria conflict, Iraq, everything, Libya has meant trillions of dollars for the military-industrial complex in the West. But then when I'm looking at the latest reports from Russia, and I'm looking at how much the sale of Russian-made weapons and planes have soared since the Syrian conflict. In fact, I was reading this article which talked about how, in a way, Russia doing their maneuvers there in Syria was showcasing their own weapons. Because every time Russia in Syria engages in these aerial bombing, etc., using some of its latest and greatest own weapons and the airplanes, within 2 days, including United Emirates and Arab Emirates and all the countries in Middle East, they started lining up and saying, we want to order. Can you send us 50 of those and 30 of these, skip the cheese? And the sales, MIC sale for Russia has been booming. Of course, ours, as we have been reporting via Newsbud, Christian Sorensen, ours has always been booming. So when I'm looking at the dollar, I'm talking about the profiteers and I'm talking about the winners. it seems to be advantageous, the latest situation for both sides, the Russian side and the Americans. So my question to you is it possible that some of these build-up tensions and amplified by the media is actually by design, and that both parties greatly, not both parties, the people of nations or even governments, but the profit makers, the profiteers, they are winning. They are winning, both with the illusionary conflict between the West and Russia, but also with the weapons sales, with the Russian MIC really doing so well. So it seems to be that it's been serving people on both sides pretty well. Is it possible that some of these tensions are by mutually agreed upon behind the scene agreements to say, you know what, why don't you have a few slices of cakes too? You know, we have been dominating the MIC weapon sales and etc. Let's have you have your dance and collect yours. Possible?
Well, that's a very good question. It probably would take writing a book to answer it in a very precise way. What I would say is that there is this definite effort on the part of some circles in the West to impose their own ideology on the world. So yeah, it is true that the Russians and the Chinese will be making some money selling their weapons. But in essence, they are defending their national sovereignty. They are defending their countries from being broken up, the way former Yugoslavia was broken up. So there is something real to this conflict. However, I should say that nationalism is not the answer. Nationalism is a defensive reaction. What we need to develop is a new internationalism, a different type of internationalism, a type that's going to go beyond nation states, that's going to connect all the people of the world who are essentially the same. You know, I taught in Russia, I'm teaching in the United States, I taught in the Balkans, I lectured all over Europe, and I can tell you that the students are everywhere the same. Our young people are everywhere the same. And this is a great hope that they could all come together, that they could get rid of their corrupt elites and then form an ideology that would value every human being for who they are and for what they can accomplish. However, at this point of time, we have to look at this defense of national sovereignty as the first step. Essentially, we have to take a step backward in order to go 2 steps forward. So, in my opinion, we have to support the development of a multipolar world. In other words, we have to develop some checks and balances on the international level, which I believe are real or should be real. In other words, the way the United States political system was set up by the founding fathers, it was set up to have checks and balances so that each branch of government can check each other, because they knew that human nature was corrupt and that the more power you have, the more power you will want. And therefore, you had to impose checks and balances. And so what we need to do is to do the same on the global level. We need to impose some checks and balances on the arrogant Anglo-American establishment dominated by the CFR people who will elect Hillary Clinton for the president of the United States. So, and then we can take the next step, which is making the world livable for everybody on this planet. Because let me remind you, the half of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. And even in the United States, there are so many people who are below the poverty line. But in order for those people to have their chances, we have to change the governing elites. And so we have to, in a certain sense, put our support to those who are fighting against this neoliberal globalism, and then see what's going to happen in the end. I agree with you that if we look at the United States establishment, and here once again, I'm talking about the establishment. I'm not talking about the people living in the United States who who essentially support what we are talking about here. They want a world of peace and cooperation and harmony, but this is not what they're getting from their elites. So in essence, the United States could be the thesis and the others could be the antithesis. And what we need is a synthesis. So we need to come out of this antagonism between Atlanticists and Eurasians. But the only way to do that at this point of time is to support the side that's weaker. And the weaker side at this point of time is the Eurasianists, even though I think they will get stronger as time goes by.
Well, that's a very good perspective, very good outlook on that, Professor. I do thank you for that. I think that's a good point to end the broadcast on. We're always looking for solutions. This is another big problem, big question. How do we solve this? It's one that's been at hand for a long time. So any final points from either of you here before we end today's roundtable?
Oh, I don't have any final point. I think that we need to be inspired to do something in the world as much as we can. Each one teach one. That's all I would say at this point.
I'm pretty much with Professor Kovacevic on this one, but I would like to put another thing on the table, and this is for the Turkish government and Turkish media. I think it's about time for them to just come on board and talk about the fact that they do have, and this is Turkey, their own nuclear capabilities, technology, weapons. They have had it since 2000. I believe it is bound to come. I believe I'm the first person to go on record with this, but I believe there are people in Turkey that believe that it's time for them to come out and just say it outright. And this puts an end to a lot of things that has to do with my state secrets, privilege, etc. But also, it's an internationally responsible thing to do. So I hope after this video airs, after we put it out, we get to hear from Turkey very soon about where they are, where they have been on their own nuclear technology and weapons and capabilities.
Well, it'll definitely change the stage. I mean, we all know that Turkey is a major power on the world stage, and that they are very critical at this key point in time for the geostrategic balance of power between the East and the West. So I'd like to thank both of my guests for joining us today on this Newsbud Roundtable edition. Be sure to check out Filip Kovacevic's new show, The Russian Newspaper Monitor. There's one episode each week. Also, it's a great show. Tune into it. I want to let everyone know that our website, newsbud.com, just recently got a facelift, you can call it. It's been redesigned. We have a mobile-friendly application on there, mobile responsiveness. It's very good. We're very excited about it. It looks great. Thank you, Sibel. Thank you, Filip. And tune in next time for the Roundtable.
Thank you, Spiro.
Support Newsbud. Visit our Kickstarter campaign and pledge today. By doing so, this is more than just a donation or a contribution. You are actively participating in independent media. At the same time, you are making a bold statement that you are sick and tired of the weaponized propaganda that we are all exposed to every day. On behalf of the Newsbud team, thank you for your support.